Alright, so the ranch is slowly starting to come together now. The horses are still doing their thing. I'm just letting them be for now and seeing how that plays out over time. For today, I think I'm going to focus a bit more on making money again. Probably continue with the cheese setup, check on the animals, clean things up a bit, and maybe go out hunting if we find something nearby. There's still a lot to build here, so we'll just keep adding things slowly. And while all that's going on, I've got more stories to go through, and these ones just keep getting worse the longer they go on. Like they start off normal, and then slowly get completely out of control. Alright, let's get into the first one. Alright, this first one is one of those situations where a small decision turns into something way bigger than expected, and by the end it's completely out of control. So this person says that during their final year of college, they were part of a group project that counted heavily toward their final grade. There were 4 people in the group, and like most group projects, everyone had different levels of motivation. 2 people were pretty serious about it, 1 person barely showed up, and then there was this one guy who was always saying he'd do his part but never really followed through. At first, it wasn't a huge problem. The project deadline was still far away, and everyone assumed things would come together eventually. But as weeks passed, it became clear that this one guy hadn't done anything. Not even small progress. Every time they asked about it, he would say something like, "Yeah, I'm working on it, I'll send it tonight," but tonight kept turning into tomorrow and then this weekend. Eventually, the deadline was getting close and the group started getting worried. So they decided to have a proper meeting and divide the work clearly. Everyone agreed on what they were responsible for. And again, the same guy said he'd handle a specific section. A few days before submission, they asked him to send his part. He said he would, but nothing came. At that point, panic started setting in. Because his section wasn't optional, it was a core part of the project. So the rest of the group had to make a decision, either wait and risk submitting an incomplete project, or redo his entire part themselves. They chose to redo it. For the next 2 days, they basically worked non-stop to cover for him. They barely slept, skipped meals, and just focused on getting everything done before the deadline. Finally, they submitted the project. It wasn't perfect, but it was complete. After submission, the guy finally messaged. He sent a half-finished version of his part and said, "Sorry, got busy at that point." Something snapped. One of the group members decided to report the situation to the professor. They explained that one member hadn't contributed at all. They even showed message history as proof. At first, it seemed like a reasonable thing to do, but that's when things started getting out of control. The professor didn't just adjust grades. He decided to investigate the entire group. He called all 4 of them in separately, asked detailed questions, compared their answers, and then things got even worse. During the investigation, the professor noticed that some parts of the project looked very different in style. He started questioning whether the work had been done collaboratively or individually. At some point, the conversation shifted. Now it wasn't just about one person not contributing. It turned into suspicion about how the entire project was completed. Eventually, the situation escalated to the point where the department got involved. What started as one person not doing their work turned into a full review of the entire group submission. In the end, everyone still passed, but the stress, meetings, and uncertainty lasted for weeks. Looking back, the storyteller says they don't even know if reporting the situation made things better or worse. Because what started as a simple complaint ended up turning into something way bigger than anyone expected. Situations like that are tricky because, on one hand, it's completely fair to speak up when someone isn't doing their part. But sometimes once you involve authority, things can expand way beyond the original issue. And again, I'm definitely not some kind of relationship expert. I'm literally just a guy reading emails while playing a game. But this feels like one of those situations where you did the right thing. It just had way bigger consequences than expected. Alright, this next story is about a lie that started small but kept growing until it became impossible to manage. So this person says that during their first job, they wanted to make a good impression on their coworkers. It was a new environment, new people, and they didn't really know how to fit in yet. During one conversation, a few coworkers were talking about hobbies. Someone mentioned going to the gym regularly, another talked about cooking, and without thinking too much, the storyteller casually said, "Yeah, I'm pretty into fitness too." At the time, it didn't feel like a big deal. It was just something they said to keep the conversation going. But then someone asked, "Oh really, what kind of workouts do you do?" Instead of correcting themselves, they continued the lie. They mentioned a few generic things like lifting weights and doing cardio. The conversation moved on. No problem, or at least that's what they thought. Over the next few weeks, that one small comment kept coming back. Coworkers started asking for advice. Someone asked for tips on workouts. Another asked about gym routines, and instead of admitting the truth, they kept improvising answers. Most of it was just things they had seen online or heard from others. At some point, one coworker suggested going to the gym together after work. That's when things started getting uncomfortable. They tried to avoid it at first, saying they were busy, saying they had other plans. But eventually, they ran out of excuses. One day, the coworker said, "All right, we're going today, no excuses." And suddenly, the situation they had been avoiding for weeks became unavoidable. They went to the gym together, and immediately it became obvious that something wasn't right. They didn't know how to use most of the equipment. They weren't familiar with basic exercises, and their coworkers started noticing. At first, it was just confusion, then it turned into questions. Eventually, the truth came out. They admitted that they weren't actually into fitness and had just said it casually that first day. The coworker laughed it off, but the story didn't end there, because somehow the story spread. Other coworkers found out, and what started as a small lie turned into something people joked about regularly. It wasn't serious or harmful, but it became one of those things that followed them around in the workplace. All because of one sentence said without thinking. That's honestly how most lies spiral. It's rarely something big at the beginning. It's usually just one small thing said in the moment, and then it slowly builds because you don't correct it early. And by the time you realize it's getting out of hand, it's already too late to easily fix. Alright, this next one is one of those awkward situations that keeps escalating the more you try to fix it. So this person says they were attending a family function, one of those big gatherings where extended relatives you barely see show up. At some point during the event, an older relative came up and started talking to them very warmly. The relative clearly recognized them. They asked about school, about family, about things from years ago. The problem was the storyteller had no idea who this person was, not even a vague idea, but instead of admitting that, they decided to just go along with it. They nodded, smiled, and answered questions in a general way. At first, it worked, but then the relative started bringing up specific memories. They mentioned things like, "Remember when you used to come over during summers?" Or, "You were always so quiet as a kid." Now the situation was getting harder to manage, because the details were becoming more specific, and instead of clarifying, the storyteller kept pretending. They responded with vague phrases like, "Yeah, I remember that," or, "That was a long time ago." The conversation continued like this for several minutes. Then suddenly the relative called over another family member and said, "Look how much they've grown." Now more people joined the conversation. And now the pressure increased, because it wasn't just one person anymore. It was multiple people who all seemed to know them. At that point, backing out felt even more awkward, so they kept going, trying to respond without giving anything away. Eventually, one of the relatives asked a direct question, something very specific, and that's when everything fell apart. They gave a response that didn't match at all. There was a pause, then someone said, "Wait, I think you're confusing them with someone else." And just like that, the entire situation flipped. It turned out the relative had mistaken them for another family member who looked similar. And instead of correcting it early, the storyteller had unknowingly continued the misunderstanding. Everyone laughed it off, but for the rest of the event, they couldn't shake the feeling of how unnecessarily complicated the situation had become. That's one of those classic situations where correcting it early would have been awkward, but way less awkward than letting it go on for too long. Once more people get involved, it becomes much harder to step back and explain the misunderstanding. Still, at least it ended in a funny way instead of something more serious. Alright, this next story is one of those situations where something feels slightly off at first and then slowly becomes something you can't ignore anymore. So this person says that during their second year of college, they moved into a new apartment closer to campus. It was a relatively quiet building, mostly students and a few working professionals. The first few weeks were completely normal. They settled into a routine, started attending classes, and didn't really interact much with the neighbors beyond the usual passing greetings in the hallway. One of those neighbors was a guy who lived directly across from them. At first, the interactions were minimal, a quick nod, occasionally holding the door open, nothing unusual. But after a couple of weeks, the neighbor started being a bit more talkative. One day, while both of them were checking their mailboxes, he started a conversation. He asked basic questions like how long they had been living there, what they were studying, things like that. It felt normal. Just casual small talk. But after that, something changed. He started appearing more frequently. If they left their apartment in the morning, he was sometimes already in the hallway. If they came back in the evening, he would occasionally step out of his apartment around the same time. At first, it was easy to assume it was coincidence. Apartment buildings have overlapping routines. But then small details started adding up. One evening, he casually mentioned that they usually got home around 6:30. The problem was they had never told him that. Another time he asked if they had finished a specific assignment yet, again something they had never mentioned. At that point, the situation started feeling a little uncomfortable. Still, they tried to ignore it, assuming maybe he was just making guesses or overhearing conversations. But then something happened that made things much harder to dismiss. One night, they ordered food delivery. The driver called saying they were outside but couldn't find the exact apartment. Before they could go downstairs, there was a knock on the door. When they opened it, the neighbor was standing there. He said, "I think this is yours," and handed over the food. That meant he had been paying attention to the delivery. Watching who it was for, that moment changed everything. After that, they started noticing more patterns. If they left for class, he sometimes left shortly after. If they came home late, his lights were still on. One time they even tested it. They left their apartment, walked down the stairs, then quietly came back up. and his door opened slightly just as they reached their floor. That's when it stopped feeling like coincidence. It started feeling like observation. They didn't confront him, there wasn't anything concrete enough to accuse him of, but they became more cautious. They changed routines slightly, avoided unnecessary interaction. Eventually, a few months later, the neighbor moved out. No explanation, no goodbye. Just gone. Nothing ever escalated into something dangerous, but the experience left a lasting impression. Sometimes it's not about something clearly happening. Sometimes it's about a pattern that just doesn't feel right. That's the kind of situation where nothing explicitly happens, but your instincts are still trying to tell you something. And honestly, those instincts exist for a reason. Even if it turns out to be nothing, being cautious in situations like that is always the safer choice. Alright, this next story is about a situation where a friendship slowly turned into something way more complicated than either person expected. So this person says they had a close friend during college who they spent a lot of time with. They met during their first year and quickly became part of the same group. They studied together, hung out after classes, and eventually became one of those pairs of friends who talked almost every day. At first, the friendship was completely normal. They supported each other during exams, shared random stories, complained about classes. Everything felt easy, but over time, something started shifting. The friend began relying on them more emotionally. At first, it was small things, talking about stress, venting about assignments, but gradually the conversations became more personal. They started sharing details about family problems, past experiences, things they hadn't told many people. The storyteller didn't think much of it, they were just being a good friend, but then the dynamic started changing. The friend began expecting more attention. If they didn't reply to messages quickly, they would ask why. If they spent time with other friends, they would question it. At first it seemed like normal closeness, but slowly it started feeling more intense. Then one day the friend said something that made everything more complicated. They admitted that they had started developing feelings. The storyteller didn't feel the same way, and that's where things began to spiral. They tried to handle it carefully. They explained that they valued the friendship but didn't want to turn it into something romantic. The friend said they understood, but their behavior didn't change. If anything, it became more emotional, more intense. They would send long messages late at night, overthink small interactions, read into things that weren't meant that way. Eventually, the friendship became exhausting. What used to feel natural now felt like pressure. Every conversation felt like it had underlying tension. The storyteller started pulling back, replying less, creating distance, but that only made things worse. The friend felt hurt, misunderstood. At some point, the situation reached a breaking point. A conversation turned into an argument. Things were said that couldn't be taken back, and just like that, the friendship ended. Looking back, the storyteller says the hardest part wasn't the ending. It was realizing how slowly things had changed. What started as a simple friendship had gradually turned into something neither of them knew how to handle. That kind of situation is tough, because it's not something that changes overnight, it builds slowly, and by the time you realize things have shifted, it's already complicated. It's one of those situations where boundaries early on can make a huge difference. Alright, this next story is one of those workplace situations that starts small, but slowly turns into something really awkward. So this person says they had recently started a new job at a small office. The team was pretty close-knit. People talked casually during work, joked around, and sometimes shared personal stories. During one lunch break, a group of coworkers were sitting together talking. The conversation turned into sharing experiences from previous jobs. People were talking about bad managers, awkward situations, things like that. Eventually, it was their turn to share something. Without thinking too much, they started telling a story about a previous manager they had worked with. They described how disorganized the manager was, how meetings would drag on without any clear purpose, how communication was always confusing. The story was told in a light, joking way, and the group was laughing along. It felt like a normal conversation. Then something happened. One of the coworkers stopped laughing. They looked at them and said, "Wait, what was the name of that company again?" They answered. And the coworker's expression changed. They said, "I think I know who you're talking about." The room went quiet. As it turned out, that manager had previously worked at the same company they were currently at. Not only that, the coworker who asked the question had worked directly with them and still spoke highly of them. At that moment, everything shifted. What had been a funny story suddenly felt uncomfortable. They tried to clarify, saying they didn't mean anything personal, that it was just their experience, but the tone had already changed. For the rest of the day, things felt slightly awkward. The coworker didn't say anything negative, but the interaction felt different. In the following days, they couldn't stop thinking about it, wondering if they had said too much, if they had unintentionally offended someone. Nothing major happened, but the situation stayed in their mind much longer than expected. All because of one story told without knowing the full context. That's a classic workplace situation. You never fully know how people are connected, And something that feels like a casual story can suddenly become awkward if there's a connection you didn't expect. It's one of those lessons you usually learn once and then never forget. Alright, this next story is one of those where something starts off as a completely normal favor and slowly turns into something way bigger than it should have been. So this person says they had a neighbor who they weren't super close with, but friendly enough to talk to occasionally. Just basic stuff. Saying hi, small conversations, nothing serious. One day the neighbor asked for a small favor. They said they were going out of town for a few days and needed someone to keep an eye on their place. Just simple things. Collecting packages, maybe watering a couple of plants. Nothing complicated. The storyteller agreed. It didn't feel like a big deal. For the first couple of days, everything was normal. They would stop by once a day, check the mail, water the plants and leave, but then on the third day, something felt slightly off. When they entered the apartment, they noticed one of the lights was already on. They were pretty sure they had turned everything off the previous day. At first, they assumed they had just forgotten. It happens, so they didn't think much of it. They continued doing what they came to do and left. The next day, it happened again. This time, it wasn't just a light. A chair in the living room was slightly out of place, again, something small, easy to ignore, but now it was happening twice. They started feeling a little uneasy. Still, they tried to rationalize it. Maybe they hadn't noticed it before. Maybe they had moved it without remembering, so they continued. On the fifth day, things escalated. They entered the apartment and immediately noticed something was wrong. One of the kitchen drawers was open, and they were absolutely sure they hadn't touched it before. At that point, it stopped feeling like coincidence. They started checking more carefully, walking through each room, looking for anything else unusual. Everything else seemed normal, but the feeling was different now. That subtle discomfort had turned into something stronger. They considered calling the neighbor, but they didn't want to overreact. There was still a chance it was nothing, so they decided to do something simple. Before leaving, they took a photo of the living room. Just in case, the next day when they came back, the difference was obvious. The same chair from earlier had been moved again, and this time it was not subtle. It was clearly in a different position. They compared it to the photo. There was no mistake. Something had changed, and they knew it wasn't them. At that point, they called the neighbor, explained everything. The neighbor was confused. They said no one else had keys. No one should be entering the apartment. That's when things became serious. The neighbor asked them to leave immediately and not go back inside. They contacted building management, and eventually security got involved. A few hours later, the situation became clear. It turned out that a maintenance worker had been entering the apartment, using a master key. At first, it seemed like they were just checking something, but the repeated visits didn't make sense. There was no scheduled maintenance, no requests made, nothing official. The building management handled the situation, but the part that stayed with the storyteller wasn't just what happened, it was how small it started. A light, a chair, a drawer, each thing easy to ignore on its own, but together it created something that couldn't be ignored anymore, and if they hadn't paid attention, they might have never realized what was happening. That's a perfect example of how small details matter. Individually, none of those things seem like a big deal, but when patterns start forming, that's when it's worth paying attention. And honestly, taking that photo was probably the smartest move in the whole situation. Alright, this next one is one of those situations where a small misunderstanding slowly turns into something way more serious than anyone expected. So this person says they were part of a friend group that had been together for years. There were about 6 people and they all knew each other pretty well. They hung out regularly, shared things openly, and generally trusted each other. At some point, one of the friends started acting a little differently. They became quieter, less engaged, not as present in conversations. At first, nobody thought much of it. People go through phases. It happens. But then something small triggered everything. One evening, the group was chatting online, just casual conversation. At some point, someone made a joke. It wasn't directed at anyone specific, just a general comment. But the friend who had been acting distant suddenly reacted strongly. They took the joke personally, responded in a way that felt out of proportion. The group was confused. They tried to explain that it wasn't meant that way. But the situation didn't calm down. Instead, it escalated. The friends started bringing up other things, past situations, small moments that nobody else had thought were serious, things that had happened weeks or even months ago. From their perspective, it all connected. It felt like a pattern, but to everyone else, it felt like things were being pulled out of context. The conversation went from confusion to tension to a full argument. At some point, sides started forming. Some people tried to calm things down, others got defensive. The original issue got lost. Now it wasn't about one joke anymore. It was about multiple misunderstandings stacked together. The situation went on for hours, messages back and forth, explanations, arguments, silences. Eventually the friend left the group chat. No message. Just gone. For the next few days, everything felt off. People talked privately, trying to understand what happened. Some reached out to the friend, but responses were short, distant. Eventually the group never fully returned to how it was before. The dynamic changed, not because of one big event, but because of multiple small things that were never addressed properly, and when they finally came out, they all came out at once, turning something small into something much bigger. That's something that happens more often than people realize. It's rarely just one moment. It's usually a buildup of small things that never get addressed, and when it finally comes out, it feels sudden even though it's been building for a long time. Alright, this next story is one of those situations where something starts off as a joke but slowly turns into something that gets completely out of hand. So this person says that during their time in college, they lived in a shared apartment with two other roommates. The environment was pretty relaxed, they joked around a lot, pulled small pranks on each other, nothing too serious. At some point, one of the roommates decided to start a harmless prank. They moved a small object from one place to another, nothing obvious, just something subtle enough that it might not be noticed immediately. The idea was simple: confuse the other roommates slightly, maybe get a reaction. At first, it worked. The roommate noticed the object had moved. They asked about it. Everyone played it off. Said they didn't know anything, it became a small joke, but instead of stopping there, the prank continued. They moved things again. Different objects, different places. Each time small enough to create confusion, but not enough to be obvious. At first it was funny, but slowly the reaction started changing. The roommate who was being pranked became more serious. They started questioning things more, looking for explanations. At some point they started locking their room, double-checking things before leaving. That's when it should have stopped, but it didn't. Instead, the prank escalated. One night, they moved multiple items at once, not just one thing. Several things, now the change was obvious. When the roommate saw it, they didn't laugh. They didn't question. They just went quiet. From that point on, everything shifted. The atmosphere in the apartment changed. The roommate became distant, more cautious, less talkative. Eventually they confronted everyone. Not in an angry way, but in a serious way. They said they felt like something wasn't right, like things were happening that they couldn't explain. That's when the prank stopped, immediately. The roommates admitted everything, explained it was just a joke, something harmless. But the damage had already been done. The roommate didn't react the way they expected. They didn't laugh. They didn't brush it off. They just said that wasn't funny. And from that point on, the relationship changed. Trust was affected. Even though it wasn't something dangerous, it had crossed a line. What started as a harmless joke had slowly turned into something that made someone genuinely uncomfortable, and once that line was crossed, it couldn't just be undone. That's one of those situations where intention and impact are completely different things. From one side, it feels harmless. From the other side, it can feel completely different. And once something crosses into making someone uncomfortable like that, it stops being a joke. Alright, this next story is one of those situations where a small decision at work slowly turns into something much bigger than expected, and by the end, it's completely out of your control. So, this person says they had been working at their company for about a year. It wasn't a huge workplace, but it wasn't tiny either. Enough people that you didn't know everyone personally, but still small enough that word traveled fast. They had built a decent reputation, reliable on time. Did their work without causing problems. At some point, a new employee joined their team. At first, everything seemed normal. The new person was quiet, polite, and mostly kept to themselves. Since the storyteller had been there longer, they were asked to help them get familiar with the workflow, show them how things were done, answer questions, just basic onboarding. For the first couple of weeks, everything went smoothly, but then small things started happening. The new employee would ask questions about tasks that had already been explained. They would forget steps, miss small details. At first, it felt normal. Learning curve, no issue. But over time, it didn't improve. In fact, it started getting worse. Simple tasks were being done incorrectly. Deadlines were missed. And eventually, some of the responsibility started falling back on the storyteller because they were the one who had trained them. At some point, the manager called them aside, asked how things were going, and in that moment they made a decision. Instead of explaining the full situation honestly, they said, "Yeah, everything's fine, they're still learning." It didn't feel like a big lie, more like avoiding conflict. They didn't want to make the new employee look bad, so they covered for them. But that's where things started getting out of control, because the manager took that response as confirmation, meaning everything was under control, so expectations stayed the same, deadlines stayed the same, pressure stayed the same, and the mistakes continued. Now the storyteller was in a difficult position because they had already said things were fine. So speaking up later felt harder. At that point, they started helping more, fixing mistakes quietly, double-checking work, covering gaps, trying to keep everything on track. But it became exhausting. They were doing their own work and partially someone else's. Eventually something bigger happened. A project was submitted with errors. Not small ones, noticeable ones, the kind that couldn't be ignored. The manager called a meeting, started asking questions, trying to figure out what went wrong, and that's when everything came back. Because now it wasn't just about one mistake, it was about a pattern. And the manager realized something didn't add up.
If everything had been fine before, how did things suddenly go wrong? That's when the situation turned. Now the storyteller had to explain everything, the mistakes, the covering, the extra work, and most importantly, why they hadn't said anything earlier. And that was the hardest part, because the original decision, the small one, was what led to everything else. In the end, the situation was resolved. But the stress, the pressure, and the feeling of losing control over something that started so small, that stayed with them much longer.
That's a really common situation. Sometimes trying to avoid a small, uncomfortable conversation early ends up creating a much bigger problem later. It's one of those things where honesty up front might feel awkward, but it usually prevents things from escalating like this. Alright, this next story is about a situation where something that started as curiosity slowly turned into something that became difficult to handle. So this person says that during college, they became part of a larger social group. Not super close with everyone, but familiar enough that they would all hang out together during events or weekends. Within that group, there were a couple of people who were much closer to each other. They had known each other for longer and often shared things privately. At some point, the storyteller noticed that there was tension between two of those people. Nothing obvious, but small signs. Less interaction, shorter conversations, different energy. At first they ignored it, it wasn't their business, but over time curiosity started building. They wanted to know what had happened, so one day while talking to one of them individually, they asked about it, just casually, nothing direct. The person opened up a little, not everything, but enough to suggest that something had gone wrong. Later they spoke to the other person, and heard a slightly different version of the story. Now instead of clarity, there were two perspectives, and they didn't match. At that point, the storyteller made a mistake. They started comparing the two, trying to piece together what actually happened. But instead of keeping that to themselves, they started mentioning small parts of one conversation to the other, not intentionally trying to cause problems. More like trying to understand. But slowly, things started getting mixed. Details crossed over, things that were said privately started appearing in other conversations. At first, nobody noticed, but eventually, one of them did. They realized that something they had shared privately had somehow reached the other person. That's when the situation escalated. Now it wasn't just about whatever had originally happened between them. It became about trust, about who said what, about how information moved. The storyteller was suddenly in the middle, not by intention, but by involvement. Conversations became tense, questions started being asked directly, and eventually it all came out, not in a calm way, but in a confrontation. Both sides realized that parts of their conversations had been shared, and even though it wasn't done with bad intention, it still caused problems because things that were meant to stay private didn't. After that, the dynamic of the group changed. The two people stopped interacting, and the storyteller found themselves stepping back from the group as well. Not because they were blamed completely, but because the situation had become too complicated, all from something that started as simple curiosity. That's one of those situations where curiosity feels harmless at the beginning, but once you start carrying information between people, even unintentionally, it can create problems very quickly. It's a good reminder that sometimes not knowing everything is actually the better option. Alright, this next story is one of those moments where something meant to be simple turns into something unexpectedly overwhelming. So this person says they were asked to help organize a small event for a group they were part of. Nothing huge, just a casual gathering. Maybe 20 to 30 people, food, music, basic setup. At first, it seemed straightforward. They agreed to help, started planning, dividing responsibilities. Everything felt manageable, but slowly, things started changing. More people got involved. Suggestions started coming in. Ideas kept expanding. What was originally a small gathering started turning into something bigger. More guests, more expectations, more planning. At some point, it stopped feeling like a small event. It started feeling like something much more complex. But by then, it was too late to scale back. Invitations had been sent, plans had been made, so they continued trying to keep everything organized, managing details, coordinating with people. As the date got closer, the pressure increased. Things started going wrong. Some supplies didn't arrive on time. People backed out of responsibilities. Last-minute changes kept happening, and slowly the situation started slipping out of control. On the day of the event, everything felt rushed. Some things were ready, others weren't. People were arriving while setup was still happening. There were small issues everywhere, not enough seating, music problems, food delays, nothing catastrophic, but enough to create constant stress. Throughout the event, they were running around trying to fix things, handling one problem after another, barely having a moment to actually enjoy it. By the end of the night, everything had technically worked out. People had a good time, nothing major failed, but the experience felt completely different from what they had originally imagined. What started as a simple plan had slowly turned into something overwhelming, and the part that stayed with them wasn't the success of the event. It was how easily something small can grow into something much bigger without you realizing it. That's a really common pattern. Things start small, manageable, simple, and then slowly grow because people keep adding more to them. And before you realize it, you're dealing with something way bigger than what you originally agreed to. It's one of those situations where setting limits early can make a huge difference. Alright, this next story is one of those situations where something small at first slowly builds into something that becomes genuinely stressful. So this person says they had a habit of using the same study room in their university library almost every day. It wasn't assigned or reserved. Just a quiet corner room that most people didn't use. Over time, it became their routine. Same seat, same table, same time every day. At first, everything was normal. They would go in, study for a few hours, and leave. But after a few weeks, they started noticing something small. There were little things on the table that they didn't remember leaving there. A pen placed slightly differently. A notebook moved a few inches. At first, it didn't seem like anything. Libraries are shared spaces, people come and go. But what felt strange was the consistency. It kept happening. Every time they came back the next day, something small would be slightly different. Not random, not messy, just moved at some point. They decided to test it. Before leaving one day, they arranged everything in a very specific way, aligned perfectly. Then they took a quick photo. The next day when they returned, it was different, not dramatically, but enough to confirm it. Something had changed. At that point, curiosity kicked in. They started coming at slightly different times, trying to see if they could notice who else used the room. One day they arrived earlier than usual, and for the first time someone else was there. Sitting in the same spot, using the same table. At first it didn't seem unusual, but then they noticed something else. The way the person had arranged their things looked almost identical to how the storyteller usually arranged theirs. Same layout, same positioning. It felt oddly familiar. They didn't say anything, just quietly sat down in another corner. Observed, after a while the person packed up and left. But before leaving they adjusted a few items on the table, moved a pen, shifted a notebook. Almost the exact same pattern the storyteller had been noticing for days. At that point, everything clicked. It wasn't random, it wasn't coincidence, it was just another person using the same space in a similar way. But because of the routine, it had slowly started feeling like something else. Looking back, the storyteller says it wasn't scary or dangerous. But it shows how easily patterns can feel strange when you don't have full context. That's a really interesting example of how our minds try to make sense of patterns. When you don't have all the information, even normal things can start to feel unusual. Once the missing piece is revealed, everything suddenly makes sense. Alright, this next story is about a situation where something said as a joke slowly turned into something much more serious. So this person says they were part of a group of friends who spent a lot of time together. They joked around constantly, teased each other. Nothing was ever taken too seriously, at least that's what everyone thought. One day, during a casual hangout, someone made a joke about one of the friends. It wasn't anything extreme. Just a light comment. Everyone laughed, including the person it was about. So it seemed fine over the next few days. Similar jokes continued. Different people, different situations, same tone. At first, it felt like normal group humor, but slowly, something changed. The jokes started becoming more frequent and slightly more targeted, still not aggressive, still within the same tone, but repeated enough that it started standing out. The person at the center of it still laughed, still went along with it, so nobody thought there was a problem. But over time, the reactions became slightly different. The laughter felt forced, the responses shorter. Eventually, during one hangout, something shifted, a joke was made again, and this time, instead of laughing, they didn't respond. There was a pause. Then they said, "Can we just not do that anymore?" The room went quiet, not because the joke was bad, but because nobody had realized it had built up like that. From their perspective, it was just normal behavior. From the other person's perspective, it had slowly become something uncomfortable. What followed wasn't an argument, but a realization that something small repeated over time had changed how it was received. After that, the group adjusted, things went back to normal, but with a better understanding that even harmless things can feel different when they happen again and again. That's a really important thing to notice. It's not always about what is said, sometimes it's about how often it's said. Repetition can change how something feels, even if the intention never changes. Alright, this last story is one of those situations where something simple turns into something that sticks with you for a long time. So this person says they were traveling alone for the first time. Nothing far, just visiting another city for a few days, exploring, walking around, seeing new places. One evening they decided to walk through a busy street area filled with shops and restaurants. It was crowded, people everywhere. Normal city atmosphere. At some point while walking, they noticed someone walking in the same direction nearby. Again, nothing unusual. But after a while they noticed the same person again, at a different street, then again, a few minutes later. At first it felt like coincidence. Busy area. People overlap, but the pattern continued.
Every time they turned a corner, walked into another street, the same person appeared again, not directly following, but always nearby. At that point, the feeling changed. It wasn't fear exactly, but awareness. They started paying more attention, changed directions slightly, went into a store, stayed inside for a few minutes, then came out, and there they were again. Now it felt intentional. They didn't confront them, didn't react, just stayed aware. Eventually, they decided to head back toward a more crowded area, somewhere with more people, more visibility. After a few minutes, the person was gone. Just like that. No confrontation, no explanation, nothing actually happened, but the experience stayed with them because it showed how quickly something normal can start feeling different when patterns appear, and how awareness alone can change how you experience a situation.
That's one of those situations where nothing clearly happens, but it still leaves an impression. Sometimes it's not about what actually occurs, it's about how your perception of a situation changes when something feels off. And just being aware in those moments can make a big difference. Alright, I think that's all the stories I have for today. Some of these honestly just kept getting worse. The more they went on, like they start small and then suddenly everything is out of control. Thanks to everyone who sent their stories in, I appreciate it. If you enjoyed the video, you can subscribe if you want to see more of these. I'll keep working on the ranch and reading through more stories like this. And if you've got your own story, anything awkward, weird, or something that just got out of hand, you can send it to the email in the description. I read all of them, so there's a good chance it might end up in a video. Anyway, I'm going to keep working on this for a bit. I'll see you in the next one.